At exactly 6 o'clock on a cool Wyoming morning, the first rays of sunlight stretched across the rolling grasslands surrounding Silver Ridge Ranch. A thin blanket of fog drifted lazily over the fields, softening the distant mountains into faded silhouettes. Mason Carter eased his weathered pickup down the gravel road he had driven thousands of times before. Every fence post, every cottonwood tree, and every bend in the road carried memories of the family who had cared for this land for more than 70 years. His late father had always told him that land was more than property. It was a promise passed from one generation to the next. As Mason rounded the final curve leading to his front entrance, something immediately felt wrong. Flashing amber lights reflected through the morning mist. 3 black SUVs were parked across his private driveway, completely blocking access to the ranch. 3 people dressed in matching black tactical uniforms worked with surprising confidence, looping a heavy steel chain through the wooden entrance gate. One of them tightened a large padlock, while another recorded the scene with a body camera mounted to his chest. Across the backs of their uniforms, bold white letters read Silver Ridge WA Patrol. Mason parked nearly 30 feet away and remained seated behind the wheel for several quiet seconds. Years of experience had taught him that the first person to lose control usually lost the argument. Instead of reacting emotionally, he simply observed. The uniforms looked convincing at first glance. Duty belts, portable radios, protective vests, metal badges. Even shoulder patches designed to resemble official law enforcement insignia to anyone driving by. They would have appeared to be legitimate officers carrying out official business. Mason quietly stepped out of his truck, closed the door behind him, and walked toward the gate with calm. "A measured steps, morning," he said politely. "Can someone explain why you're chaining my gate shut?" The tallest member of the group barely looked up. "This road has been placed under wall access." "Control," he replied confidently. "You'll need authorization before entering." Mason glanced around the empty valley before looking back at the man. "My family has owned this ranch longer than your homeowners association has existed." Another patrol member smirked. "Not anymore." Before Mason could answer, a spotless white luxury SUV rolled to a stop behind the patrol vehicles. The driver's door opened, and Rebecca Sterling stepped out, wearing a tailored cream-colored blazer, polished boots, and expensive sunglasses. Her confident smile suggested she expected complete obedience the moment she arrived. She approached without hesitation. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said pleasantly. "I was hoping we'd finally settle this professionally." Mason folded his arms. Professional people usually ask permission before entering. "Private property." Rebecca ignored the comment. "The Silver Ridge Homeowners Association has expanded its community security program. This access road now falls under our patrol jurisdiction." Mason looked directly at her. "Show me the court order." "There isn't one. The county authorization. You don't need to concern yourself with county paperwork. The property deed giving your wall ownership." Rebecca smiled wider. Our board voted unanimously for a brief moment. Silence settled over the ranch. Even the patrol members appeared confident that those words alone ended the discussion. Instead, Mason calmly nodded. "So your board meeting changed Wyoming property law overnight?" One patrol officer laughed loudly. Rebecca's smile hardened. "This road benefits our community now." "It benefits my ranch," Mason replied. "And you're standing on my land." She waved a dismissive hand toward her patrol. Finished locking the gate, the sound of steel scraping against steel echoed across the quiet valley. One patrol member stepped closer to Mason, until only a few feet separated them. "You've been instructed to leave," he said firmly. Mason didn't move. "This is my front gate." The man reached out, placing a hand firmly on Mason's shoulder, as though removing him from someone else's property. "You heard the order for the first time that morning." Mason's eyes shifted away from the man's face. He studied the shoulder patch stitched onto the tactical uniform. The eagle, the badge shape, the numbering format, every detail had been carefully designed to imitate the appearance of official authority without actually belonging to any recognized agency. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. He slowly looked back at Rebecca, who approved these uniforms. Rebecca crossed her arms confidently. "Our legal team reviewed everything." Mason gave a small nod, his voice remaining calm despite the growing tension. "I've got one piece of advice for you." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "Don't change a single thing." Mason didn't raise his voice after speaking those final words instead. He turned, walked back toward his pickup, and drove away without another argument. Rebecca Sterling watched him disappear down the gravel road and smiled with quiet satisfaction. To her, his silence looked exactly like defeat. She believed she had finally broken the stubborn rancher, who had refused every offer, every notice, and every demand she had sent over the past several months. She couldn't have been more mistaken. The moment Mason reached the ranch house, he parked beside the old red barn and walked inside without rushing. Hanging on the wall near the kitchen door was a simple leather notebook. He opened it and carefully wrote the date, the exact time, the number of vehicles parked at his gate, the names printed on every visible badge, and the sequence of events exactly as they had happened. Years of experience had taught him that memories fade, but written facts remain powerful. His phone buzzed. It was Eleanor Graves, the attorney who had represented the Carter family for nearly 20 years. "How bad is it?" she asked. "They crossed onto the property again," Mason answered calmly. "Only this time they chained the front gate and claimed they had jurisdiction over my land." There was a brief silence before Eleanor spoke again. "Did you argue with them? No good. They're becoming bolder." "I expected they would." Mason looked out the kitchen window toward the distant hills where his father used to ride every morning before sunrise. "They're not trying to scare me anymore," he said quietly. "They're trying to create the appearance of authority." Eleanor understood exactly what he meant. "They're building a story, so am I after ending the call?" Mason unlocked an old filing cabinet tucked beneath the staircase. Inside were neatly labeled folders, filled with photographs, letters, certified mail receipts, county survey maps, property deeds, and security footage dating back almost 8 months. Rebecca's campaign hadn't started with chains or fake patrol officers. It had started with letters, one after another. The first accused him of violating while landscaping standards. The second demanded he repaint a fence that wasn't part of their community. Another insisted he removed livestock from what they described as shared recreational space. Mason had smiled the day he read that one. There was only one problem. Silver Ridge Ranch wasn't part of the Homeowners Association. It never had been. Every letter carried official-looking logos, legal language, and references to rules that had absolutely no authority over his property. Most people would have thrown them away in frustration. Mason kept every single one. Each envelope was scanned, each postmark photographed, each document stored in chronological order. His father had always believed that truth eventually reveals itself if someone is patient enough to preserve it. Mason had never forgotten those words 3 months earlier. Rebecca had personally visited the ranch with what sounded like a generous offer she wanted: permanent access through the Eastern Service, road crossing Mason's property, the entire community benefits, she had explained with a polished smile. Mason had listened respectfully before answering. "My answer is still no." Rebecca increased the offer by another $2 million. Again, he refused. Money had never been the issue. Near the eastern boundary stood 50 acres of restored prairie that Mason's late father had spent decades protecting native grasses, migrating wildlife, and wetlands. Had slowly returned after years of careful restoration. Walter Carter used to tell his son that some things become priceless the moment people stop measuring them by dollars. That promise mattered more than any contract. Rebecca had driven away that afternoon, believing Mason simply needed more pressure. Instead of accepting his decision, she escalated. Within weeks, mysterious survey markers appeared on his land. Unknown vehicles began photographing his gates. Drones occasionally hovered above the property. Then came the newly formed WAP patrol. Mason never confronted them. He simply documented everything. Along the ranch roads, hidden security cameras quietly recorded every trespass. Motion sensors logged vehicle movements. License plates were photographed automatically. Even conversations near the front gate were captured by discreet microphones installed beneath fence posts months earlier. The system wasn't designed to trap anyone. It existed to preserve the truth. That afternoon, Mason drove into town for supplies. Inside the local hardware store, several longtime neighbors approached him. Everyone had heard rumors about the HOA's new patrol. One elderly rancher shook his head. "They stopped my grandson yesterday and asked where he was going." Another woman frowned. "They told my daughter she needed permission to use County Road 9. Mason listened carefully without interrupting. Fear was spreading, not because the patrol had real authority, because they looked convincing, enough that ordinary people assumed they did as Mason left the store. He noticed a familiar black SUV parked across the street. The same tactical uniforms, the same fake badges this time, however. One of the patrol members was questioning a young black woman loading groceries into the back of her SUV. She looked to be in her early 30s, dressed in business clothes, after what appeared to be a long work day. One patrol member demanded identification, while another stood beside her vehicle. Speaking with unnecessary authority, the woman remained calm despite the pressure. "I'm happy to cooperate with real law enforcement," she said confidently. "But before I answer another question, I'd like to know exactly who you work for." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One pointed toward the badge on his vest. "Was Silver Ridge WA Patrol." She nodded politely. "I asked who gave you legal authority. Neither." Man answered at that moment a marked county sheriff's patrol vehicle turned into the parking lot during its routine patrol. The deputy immediately noticed the tense conversation and walked over with professional composure, asking everyone to step back while he clarified the situation. Within seconds, the fake patrol members' confidence began to fade as the deputy requested identification, business credentials, and documentation supporting their claimed authority. Mason watched quietly from across the parking lot, realizing that experienced law enforcement officers recognized the difference between genuine public service and people merely dressed to imitate it. The deputy treated everyone respectfully, including the young woman whose calm confidence and insistence on lawful authority reminded Mason that courage often speaks most clearly through patience rather than anger. Rebecca Sterling still believed appearances could replace the law, but the cracks in her carefully built illusion were beginning to show. The following Monday began, much like every other morning at Silver Ridge Ranch, but the atmosphere felt different. The steel chain that had once blocked Mason Carter's front gate was still hanging there, exactly where the fake WAP patrol had left it. Mason had resisted every temptation to remove it himself. Instead, he had trusted the process, believing that facts carried more weight than anger. Shortly after sunrise, two marked sheriff's patrol vehicles rolled slowly onto the county road. Their emergency lights were off. There was no dramatic rush, only quiet professionalism. Deputies stepped out, greeted Mason respectfully, and began documenting the scene with photographs and measurements. Minutes later, Rebecca Sterling arrived in her white SUV with the same confidence she had shown days earlier. 3 members of the WAP patrol climbed out behind her, still wearing their matching tactical uniforms and imitation badges. Rebecca smiled as though she expected the deputies to support her claims. "Deputies," she said confidently, "thank you for coming. This gentleman continues interfering with our community access program." The senior deputy listened without interruption. When she finished speaking, he simply asked one question. "Can you provide any legal document showing your association owns this property or has authority to control access to it?" Rebecca hesitated. "Our board approved it. I'm asking for a deed, easement, court order, or county authorization." Silence settled over the entrance. She had none. Mason quietly handed the deputies a well-organized folder containing certified property deeds, survey maps, county records, dated photographs, and months of documented trespassing incidents. Every page had been carefully arranged in chronological order. One deputy compared the official county survey with the location of the chained gate. "There isn't any dispute here," he said calmly. "This entrance is entirely on Mr. Carter's private property." Another deputy examined one of the tactical uniforms more closely. "These patches are misleading," he observed. "They resemble official law enforcement identifiers." The confidence that had filled the fake patrol only moments earlier quickly disappeared. The deputies instructed everyone to remove the chain immediately. No arguments followed. The lock clicked open, and the heavy chain fell harmlessly onto the gravel road. For the first time in weeks, the entrance to Silver Ridge Ranch stood open again. As everyone watched, the young black woman Mason had seen in town a few days earlier pulled into the driveway. She had come to deliver paperwork she had promised to share after witnessing the WAP patrol question residents without clear authority. She thanked the deputies for handling the situation with professionalism and respect. "It's reassuring," she said, "to see real public servants let facts, not intimidation." decide the outcome, the senior deputy nodded. That's exactly how it's supposed to work? Rebecca lowered her eyes. The authority she had tried to project had disappeared the moment it was tested against the law. Mason looked across the open fields his father had loved for decades. He wasn't celebrating someone else's embarrassment. He was simply grateful that patience, honesty, and proper legal process had protected the promise his family had kept for generations. Before leaving, one deputy turned to Mason. You handled this the right way. You documented everything. Stayed calm and gave us what we needed. Mason smiled. My father always said that the truth doesn't need the loudest voice. It just needs someone willing to protect it. The deputies shook his hand before driving away, leaving the ranch peaceful once again. As the morning sun rose higher over Silver Ridge, the old wooden gate stood exactly where it had always belonged. Not because one person demanded it, but because the law, evidence, and integrity prevailed. Some victories aren't won through shouting, they're earned through patience, courage, and respect for the truth. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is simply the one who refuses to surrender their principles. If this story reminded you that integrity is stronger than intimidation, share your thoughts in the comments.